Good afternoon. I'm Keval Ditani.
I'm Natasha Rieger-Jones.
I'm Chris Tomouth, and welcome to Warwick Congress Weekly. This week we'll be talking about increasing pressures on the NRA, the proposal to arm teachers in the US, Trump's new sanctions in North Korea, and Paul Manafort's alleged payments to former EU politicians.
We'll also have a selection of financial news from the week, news on villages in Myanmar, McNichol's resignation, as well as news on the new Google Assistant.
We'll be discussing some industrial fishing proposals, the Twitter purge of bot accounts, the UN-Syria truce vote, and finally, a university fee review in the UK. But first, as always, we're going to tell you a bit about Warwick Congress, who we are, what we do, and how we do it.
Warwick Congress is one of the fastest growing student-run initiatives in the UK that aims to unite the disciplines of finance, economics, politics and law into a single platform. To stay up to date with everything we do, sign up for free membership on our website www.warwickcongress.com.
Our hope is that Warwick Congress Weekly can inform our listeners, so if you have any questions, queries or opinions, then please message and let us know. You can do so by going to www.radio.warwick.ac.uk and pressing the message tab on the top right corner, or you can tweet us at raw1251am.
So, for our first story of the week, it's something that's been dominating headlines pretty much internationally, and that is the increasing pressure on the NRA. So what have you got for us, Natasha?
Well, basically before last week, membership of the National Rifle Association meant gaining a lot of access to discounts, such as special rates on auto insurance policies, through to cheaper flights when you booked through the website. However, in the wake of the massacre in Florida earlier this month, which killed 17 students and staff, which we spoke about last week, activists have flooded to social media with calls to end corporate partnerships with the NRA. And since Thursday, more than a dozen brands have severed ties with the NRA in an act of protest, including the First National Bank of Omaha, Enterprise Rent-A-Car, Symantec, which makes the Norton antivirus software, Simply Safe, which makes home security systems, United Airlines, and Paramount RX, which works with third-party vendors to provide prescription drug discount programs to NRA members. So a lot of benefits there that NRA members will no longer receive. And in a statement, the National Rifle Association called such decisions a shameful display of political and civic cowardice. And this kind of all comes at a time when the NRA is pushing back against what are actually quite modest proposals from Donald Trump and other Republicans to change US gun laws in wake of the Florida shooting. So some proposals include raising the age limit for buying certain guns from the age of 18 to 21, as well as banning bump stocks, which enable semi-automatic rifles to shoot hundreds of rounds a minute like fully automatic weapons. And there's also growing debate on Twitter, especially, about whether teachers should actually be given guns to help better protect their students. This is a proposal that's been backed by Trump and the NRA, but a lot of Democrats and teachers have sort of criticised on Twitter, saying that instead of being armed with guns, they should be armed with better educational funding. And I think Chris has more on this story.
Yeah, so we've seen that obviously Trump has been calling for this, and however the survivors of the attack have said these measures will not be enough to fight increasing sort of gun problems in US schools. And with the proposal, Trump said that if you had a teacher who was adept at firearms, they could very well end the attack very quickly. And also, Trump has even suggested giving bonuses to teachers for carrying guns. So
this is obviously a really emotionally and politically charged topic. So what's been public response to his statements? Yeah,
of course, the gun control debate generates so much controversy, and many feel that arming teachers cannot be the solution to the gun problem in America nowadays. And the survivors of last week's deadly shooting have called for stricter gun laws, much more than what Trump is proposing, prompting the nationwide activist movement #NeverAgain. And so we've seen a lot of news saying that in the case of most shootings, the shooters kill themselves or else set out to be killed, which is seen as sort of the main problem with arming teachers, where it will do nothing. And Randy Weingarten, president of the American Federation of Teachers, said in a statement that anyone who wants guns in schools has no understanding of what goes on inside them, or worse, doesn't care. So this is obviously big criticism of the Trump proposals. However, this sort of proposal, it's not new. And we saw in 2013 there was a poll conducted asking teachers whether they would approve of being armed in the classroom, and overwhelmingly, 72% of teachers said they would not want to carry a gun, even if the law allowed. So I think that's sort of overwhelming.
So I think any measure like this would have to pass through Congress. So what is, I guess, governmental position? So I'd assume Democrats don't support it. What about Republicans, given they have a majority in both houses?
Yeah, of course that the Republicans and also the powerful gun lobby want sort of any proposal that doesn't harm what they see as their fundamental rights. And the White House indicated on Thursday that the government could come up with the money to fund as many as 1 million teachers being trained and armed with guns across America, and this would act as a deterrent. And of course, the president of the NRA, Wayne LaPierre, blamed the Florida attacks not on current gun laws, but on the failure of the FBI on following up on a tip about the former student suspected of carrying out the attacks. And he said that the NRA would help any US school with their safety and security free of charge, but it seems they sort of draw the line at any sort of considerable gun control.
So I don't think this topic is going to go away anytime soon, which means we will be bringing you news on it whenever we can. And it will probably be quite interesting to see how many potential presidential candidates do approach the topic. Marco Rubio had a town hall last night that was very emotionally charged in Florida, which is his home state. So it'd be quite interesting to see how prospective senators or congressmen tackle this, especially with upcoming elections later in the year and presidential elections in less than 3 years. But the US is obviously in the news internationally as well, and President Trump announced on Friday that the US Treasury would be imposing new sanctions against North Korea. And he made a speech at the Conservative Political Action Conference, with Trump saying that the heaviest sanctions ever would be imposed on North Korea, in a signal that the US would heighten its economic pressure against the state.
So obviously we've seen Trump talk. We've seen Trump talking about the sanctions. What will these entail exactly?
So they're designed to specifically target shipping and trading companies as well as vessels in an effort to isolate North Korea. And the US government imposed sanctions against 27 entities and 28 vessels, either registered or flagged in several countries, including North Korea, China, and Singapore.
And how will these sort of sanctions work? Against these several countries. It's obviously quite a big operation.
Yeah, so in a statement on Friday, Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin said that the US is aggressively targeting all illicit avenues used by North Korea to evade sanctions. And the US also made it clear that it would continue to target those who facilitate North Korea, threatening consequences for helping the rogue state. And North Korea has been known to falsify and conceal information displayed on North Korean vessels and conduct ship-to-ship transfers, currently prohibited by the UN. And while economic pressures will focus on maritime activity, the hope from the US and Trump is that the sanctions are part of a wider campaign to enforce maximum pressure aimed at denuclearization of the North Korean state.
I mean, you've kind of mentioned it there that, there are already UN sanctions imposed on North Korea. So what do you think will happen, if these American sanctions don't work?
Well, I mean, President Trump didn't just stop there. And after the sanctions were announced, he reiterated the possibility of military action if the sanctions didn't have their desired effect, with Trump saying, if the sanctions don't work, we'll have to go to phase 2. Phase 2 may be a very rough thing, may be very, very unfortunate for the world. So quite foreboding comments there.
Yeah, as you said, this is a very strong comment from Trump. What has been the general North Korean response to the announcement of the sanctions?
Well, North Korea have quite obviously condemned the sanctions, accusing the US of trying to undermine an improvement in inter-Korean relations during the Winter Olympics, which state media said in a statement. And we saw North Korean officials present at the closing ceremony of the Winter Olympics just a few days ago in South Korea. And still, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has left the door open to hold talks with the US, according to the South Korean presidential office. So there is probably quite a lot of room for development here on this story. Meanwhile, shifting our focus back to the EU, there are quite significant allegations against Paul Manafort. So, Tash, what are the allegations against Mr. Manafort in the indictment that he's received?
Yeah, so the Trump campaign chief, Paul Manafort, faces new charges of conspiracy, money laundering, failing to register as an agent for a foreign actor, and making false statements. And all of these charges relate to his work for Ukraine's pro-Russian Party of Regions and its leader, Viktor Yanukovych. He was president from 2010 to 2014, until anti-government protests saw him escape to Russia.
So what did Mr. Manafort do wrong?
Well, essentially, as part of his work, Mr. Manafort made millions of dollars through a lobbying campaign that aimed to bolster the Ukrainian government's reputations with Europe and the US. However, as required by law, he actually failed to disclose the financial rewards for this work, which were hidden in offshore accounts.
So how did he attempt to hide his actual work? Like, he's hidden the money, but how did he hide the work that he did?
Well, this was quite a sneaky way of doing it. Essentially, he tried to put some distance between his lobbying work and its links with Yanukovych by creating a body of ex-European politicians, informally called the Habsburg Group, to whom he paid over €2 million to, which is the equivalent of around $2.5 million.
So who's suspected of being involved then in this sort of Habsburg group?
Well, the indictment doesn't name any particular members of the Habsburg group, but it does say that the body was managed by a former European chancellor, and there's a lot of speculation as to who that former chancellor could be, with a lot of kind of evidence pointing to Alfred Gunnersbauer, who was Austria's chancellor from 2007 to 2008, as well as former Italian Prime Minister Romano Prodi, who's also been linked in media reports to the group, but both have denied being involved.
I'd assume they wouldn't admit it anyway in the press, given they've gone through this much attempt to hide it. So now, as always, it's time for the financial news of the week. And this week, the Mobile World Congress is in full swing in Barcelona. And it's a trade show that brings together mobile and phone manufacturers, distributors, carriers, and engineers. So all the biggest ones in the world, apart from Apple, to present their latest work and share their vision of the future. And some of the biggest news out of the Mobile World Congress has been about 5G and 5G airwaves. Airbus, Delta, Sprint, and others have formed an alliance to develop in-flight 5G services through satellite technology. So that could be something that hits aeroplanes in the next 5 to 10 years. Meanwhile, Nokia is developing network solutions for Vodafone Italy's 5G trial in Milan, and Huawei has unveiled its first 5G chip in a challenge to Qualcomm and Intel, who also make chips for mobile phones. Representatives from the US, Mexico, and Canada opened the 7th round of NAFTA negotiations on Sunday, hoping for a breakthrough on the toughest issues before upcoming elections. The meeting follows a report from the Washington Post that suggested Mexico's President Enrique Peña Nieto shelved plans to make his first visit to the White House following a testy call with President Trump over border wall funding. Morgan Stanley have made a fairly bullish bond call, taking on Goldman Sachs and Warren Buffett. The Treasury bond sell-off in the world bond market began in September and increased in January, but Matthew Hornbach, the global head of interest rate strategy at Morgan Stanley, has said, "We think the bell has tolled for the best of the bear market in longer duration bonds. We like the long end," indicating a movement of strategy towards longer rated Treasury bonds. The chairman of the Swiss Stock Exchange has said that the country should launch a cryptocurrency version of the Swiss franc to gain a competitive lead in digital technologies. An e-franc, backed by the Swiss Central Bank, would boost the local economy, as well as electronic payment systems. Earlier this year, Johann Schneider-Ammann, the economics minister, said Switzerland wanted to be in the crypto nation. Samsung has launched its flagship S9 and S9 Plus smartphones with improved cameras and augmented reality capabilities to challenge the iPhone X. While the device itself doesn't look radically different than the Galaxy S8, it includes many new and improved features, among them Qualcomm's latest Snapdragon 845 processor, stereo speakers for a surround sound-like experience, wireless charging, a headphone jack, and upgraded smart assistant Bixby. I find it interesting that they have to add a headphone jack there, but I guess given the iPhone X doesn't have one, that's apparently a feature that phones need. And the list of companies cutting ties with partnerships with the NRA, as we heard earlier, has continued to grow, and some other companies that weren't mentioned earlier are Chubb, MetLife, Symantec, Delta Air, Avis Budget Group, Hertz, and Enterprise, which operate Enterprise, Alamo, and national rental car chains. And last week we brought you some news on Black Panther's box office opening, and As of Monday, Black Panther had made a total of $704 million worldwide since its release, and I can only imagine that figure's gone up over the last 24 hours. So a very, very successful film we see there. Moving on from the financial section, Chris has got news of the Rohingya villages in Myanmar.
Yeah, so obviously last year we saw the apparent awful, it seems like signs of a genocide against the Rohingya people. And we saw last week that an entire Rohingya villages had been burnt down in Myanmar. And we saw this from satellite images showing widespread destruction, which the Human Rights Watch have flagged up. And the group said that at least 55 villages, many of which were already damaged and by arson, had been completely bulldozed. And that they argue that these villages should be treated as crime scenes, as evidence of genocide and preserved. And ever since last year, we've seen that more than 500,000 Rohingya people have fled destruction. And the UN have called this a textbook example of ethnic cleansing, very much what we saw in the 90s, in Yugoslavia. These villages where the Rohingya had lived were burned, and several thousand people were killed by the army in Myanmar. And this was this was in retaliation, actually, we think, from the army after Rohingya militants staged a series of attacks on police outposts.
So who are the Rohingya? What are their origins?
Yeah, obviously we saw know a lot about the Rohingyas last year. So they are the Muslim ethnic group, which has lived in majority Buddhist Myanmar for generations, and there's always been sort of tension between these two groups, and because of this, because the Buddhists are the ruling majority, they're denied citizenship and other rights by the country, which considers them to be illegal immigrants from Bangladesh, despite living there for generations.
So who is targeting them? Because it kind of sounds like the government and the military are almost working in tandem to expel them from the state. Yeah,
obviously, but the government have, we can see that there's a big role that they played there, but the government has claimed that the burning is being done by Muslim militants and the Rohingya inhabitants themselves, very strangely. We actually saw that BBC journalist was allowed to visit the burning and destroyed villages, and he spoke to those who had just set a house alight, and they said they had done it with the help of the police, the state police. And when he asked residents who they were most afraid of, and they replied, the government. So this is obviously very damning for the Myanmar administration. And however, the Myanmar military said that it's fighting the militants and denies targeting civilians, and the government said it has begun building transit camps to accommodate returnees who had fled from Myanmar last year, and there are plans to build new villages. But the Human Rights Watch obviously said the apparent destruction of the homes raises evidence, for legal claims from the exile Rohingya. So it'd be very hard, to see their future in a country where they're hated by the administration.
So it'd be quite interesting, but also quite alarming to see how this story continues to unfold. We have seen, like you said, a mass migration over the borders of Bangladesh. And in news closer to home, Ian McNicol, the General Secretary of the Labour Party, has resigned, which I believe Tash has some news for us about.
I do indeed. So essentially, Ian McNicol has resigned from his role, stating that he wanted to pursue new challenges. And he's served as the Labour Party's most senior employee since 2011, with many of his responsibilities including recruiting party staff, overseeing campaigns, organising annual conferences, and also guarding Labour's legal and constitutional structures. But there's been a lot of kind of speculation that McNicol has actually resigned due to Jeremy Corbyn's continued popularity within the party. And during an attempt in 2016 by Labour MPs to remove Corbyn as leader, McNicol actually reportedly was accused of trying to stop Corbyn from standing from re-election. And this sort of led to a row and numerous reports that Corbyn's allies were plotting to dislodge McNicol as the party's chief, especially due to the turmoil that occurred in the wake of the EU referendum result.
So do we know who's going to replace McNicol?
Well, McNichol's successor will be confirmed at the Labour Party's annual conference following a recommendation by the National Executive Committee. And it's not quite sure when that's going to take place yet. But the left of the party tends to have a majority in this committee, so it is quite likely that McNichol will be replaced by an ally of Corbyn, quite ironically there. And on his resignation, McNichol stated that he will continue to support Jeremy Corbyn's leadership and will work closely with him and the whole parliamentary team to take Labour to victory at the next general election. And kind of continuing on the theme of the Labour Party, Barry Gardner, who's the shadow International Trade Secretary, has insisted that Labour cannot support single market membership. And as he stated, doing so would dishonour what the British people voted for in the EU referendum. And his comments actually come at a time when more than 80 senior Labour figures have issued an open statement arguing that only staying in the single market can avert huge economic damage from Brexit. And in a speech in Coventry quite recently, Corbyn did state that Labour wanted to create a clear dividing line between between the Conservatives and Labour over Brexit by committing to keep the UK in the customs union. So it does appear like there are quite a lot of internal divisions happening within the Labour Party at the minute.
That's something that's obviously not going to go away. Tasha's Brexit update, as per. Meanwhile, Google actually have released news about a new Google Assistant, which is their answer to Amazon's Alexa. And it's receiving huge upgrades this year, including the ability to understand and speak 30 languages by the close of 2018, which will represent around 95% of Android users, which Google hopes will increase over time. The Google Assistant will also be able to speak more than one language at a time, meaning that it will automatically detect your language each time you speak and respond accordingly, so you wouldn't have to set a language, a positive for any multilingual users of the technology.
I mean, this all sounds really advanced, so what other upgrades are being introduced?
So last week they announced that there would be 2 other new features, routines and location-based reminders. Routines were first announced back in October 2017, and they'll allow users to create personalised commands and responses. So an example of this would be, "OK Google, I'm home," which would automatically turn on the lights or adjust the thermostat, which sounds pretty cool. And it also allow users to give multiple commands at the same time, which the assistant will be able to deal with, unlike the multi-language support. Routines is expected to be launched in the coming weeks. First in the US, which Google hope will be a successful test. I assume you don't need to have your lights connected to a Google system to make them switch on there. The other new feature is location-based reminders, which has already been a feature on Android smartphones and will now be implemented on Google Assistant on Google Home devices. And Google Home devices obviously will stay at home, but will be used to set reminders that can link with your Android device and remind you if you're away from home. That feature does not have an exact date, but again, it's expected to be rolled out in the coming weeks.
I mean, this all sounds really impressive. So how has the Google Assistant fared since it's been released?
Well, it debuted in May 2016 to rival Amazon's Alexa, and from its inception it had only been available on the Google Pixel phone, and then other Android phones adopted it. It was also originally only available in English, and it's currently only available in 8 languages. But the aim of adding 22 more in the next 10 months kind of demonstrates the progress that Google Assistant software has made, and it may indeed help Google in their battle against Amazon and Apple. Some other quite interesting news over the last week has been about ocean fishing, which I believe Chris has some news on.
Yeah, so last week new research showed that more than half the world's oceans are being fished by industrial ships, which obviously is, poses a real threat to continuing depletion of marine resources and the health of the oceans.
So how was the research conducted?
So yeah, the research was sort of conducted and published for the journal Science, and it was based on maps created by feedback from more than 70,000 vessels on the seas. And this feedback showed that commercial shipping covers 55% of the ocean surface and covers a greater surface area than agriculture does on land. So obviously this raises huge concerns about the marine health and overfishing, and also the sustainability of the trawler fishing industry itself, which, overfishing could lead to loss of jobs and the loss of a whole industry. And the research actually found that the bulk of the activity, around an amazing 85%, was perpetrated by just 5 countries: China, Spain, Taiwan, which is a remarkably small country, it's only 23 million people, Japan and South Korea. Also showed how influential this fishing is. So the research found that the fishing declined strongly on weekends and on festive celebrations like Chinese New Year, which obviously shows the huge footprint the Chinese make in industrial fishing.
So what will the effects of this research on the global outlook of fishing be? I mean, what can it impact?
Yeah, hopefully the data will have a huge effect on the way ocean fishing is viewed, and it helps to explain also why there's been extreme decline in fish stocks recently, which the UN found that a third of commercial fish stocks are being caught at an unsustainable level. And of course, if this overfishing continues, we could see, as I said, the commercial fishing industry dying due to complete depletion of resources. This could mean massive unemployment of one of the largest industries for many countries, such as Taiwan. This could be devastating for them. And we've actually seen some efforts from China to combat this problem since they've implemented a nationwide fishing ban that only lasts about 3 months. And to further fight this, they sort of announced that they may institute a total ban on river fishing in rivers like the Yangtze and the Yellow River. And however, it'll be interesting to see whether countries will make huge changes to help protect the environment and the fishing industry itself, since, for countries like China, Taiwan, Japan, this is a huge industry, so cutting back on it may, hurt them.
I mean, an area where we have seen huge changes over the last few days is on Twitter.
Yeah, the big news last week is that Twitter purged thousands of suspected malicious bot accounts, which has led to a lot of backlash. So bot accounts are Twitter accounts that use automated software to send out tweets, and Twitter does allow this in some circumstances, but forbids the use of these to post misleading and malicious content, as they call it. And so after last week, dozens of users have reported that they had their account suspended until they provided a telephone number, which then they had to verify to prove that they were real.
I can imagine that'd be quite annoying. So has there been any backlash?
So as I said, there's been huge backlash, but mostly from what is seen as sort of the right-wing and conservative Twitter accounts, who say that there may be a political motive behind this move from Twitter. A deliberate political crackdown, which they have dubbed Twitter lockouts. So we saw many sort of alt-right figures complaining that they had lost many followers. So one of the alt-right figureheads, Richard Spencer, who's actually accused of being a white nationalist, said that I've lost close to 1,000 followers over the past few hours, major purge underway. And this has also come in the wake of indictment of 13 Russian nationals and 3 Russian firms by sort of the US Special Counsel Robert Mueller. And obviously, these Russians have been using bot accounts, and many others have been suspected of using bot accounts to flood the internet with pro-Russian propaganda.
So what's Twitter's response been to those sorts of comments?
Yeah, so in their statement they released last week, Twitter assured that they were apolitical and that they enforced their rules without political bias. And they said that every day we proactively look for suspicious account behaviours that indicate inorganic or automated activity, violations of our policies around having multiple accounts or abuse. However, despite this, it's expected that the continuing backlash will come towards Twitter from right-leaning Twitter accounts, and they often sort of criticise Twitter as a left-wing echo chamber.
So that's something that we may all see on our own social media timelines in the next few days or so. Meanwhile, arguably the biggest news of the last few weeks has been the UN come out of the UN and the UN Security Council concerning Syria.
Yeah, so essentially the UN Security Council is struggling to agree to a resolution which seeks a ceasefire in Syria, and the vote keeps getting delayed and has actually been pushed back until Saturday. And Russia wanted to make changes to the draft that currently calls for a 30-day calm to allow for aid deliveries and medical evacuations. And many Western diplomats have accused Russia, which is one of Syria's key allies, of stalling for time, with France saying that failure to act might actually bring about the end of the UN itself. So kind of tensions are very high in this area, and clearly it's a huge issue. And this comes at a time when there's been a lot of outrage at the kind of circumstances that civilians in the eastern Ghouta rebel enclave find themselves in, with activists saying that 462 people have been killed this week alone. And the United States, the UK and France have called for the resolution to be approved without delay in order to kind of help these people as quickly as possible. And commenting on Friday evening, Donald Trump pointed the finger to blame firmly at Russia and Iran for the humanitarian crisis that's currently developing in Syria, with Trump saying what these three countries have done to people over the last short period of time is a disgrace. So kind of huge words that are being thrown about.
So what is exactly the content of the draft resolution?
Well, the draft resolution was put forward by Kuwait and Sweden, and it essentially calls for a nationwide truce to go into effect 72 hours after the resolution is passed, with medical evacuations and aid deliveries being sort of initiated 40 hours after that. And the draft also kind of highlights the fact that 5.6 million people in 1,244 communities across the area are in acute need of kind of this medical help. And the resolution also calls for all parties to avoid establishing military positions in civilian areas, including schools and hospitals, with sieges of populated areas ought to be lifted. So yeah, it's kind of a major kind of sweeping resolution if it is passed.
So we'll bring you an update on that next week when we hope that a ceasefire is in place. And our final story is about UK universities, specifically their fees, with Theresa May calling for better value for students in England, but she has ruled out completely removing tuition fees. She's launched a review of tuition fees and university funding to be chaired by the author and financier Philip Augar. Labour, on the other hand, have said it would abolish fees and bring back maintenance grants. But Theresa May said that scrapping fees would push up taxes and mean limiting the number of universities' places. The Prime Minister said in a speech in Derby that she remained committed to the principle that students who benefit directly from higher education should contribute directly towards the cost of it. And in announcing the year-long review of student finance and university funding, Theresa May warned that the system has failed to deliver sufficient competition on price. Almost all courses are charged at a maximum of £9,250 per year, and interest rates are up to 6.1% on student loans. The Prime Minister said students in England faced one of the most expensive systems of university tuition in the world, and the level of fees charged do not relate to the cost or quality of the course. Lord Adonis has rejected the proposed idea of different subjects having different costs as a big backward step, which would reduce the numbers applying for science subjects if they became more expensive than arts and humanities. The tuition fee review also will consider ways of reducing costs, such as cutting interest rates on loans and reintroducing maintenance grants for disadvantaged students, as well as examining the level of fees. So that's something that I guess affects all of us in some way, directly or indirectly, whether it's now or maybe in a decade or two if we have our own children then going to university. But I believe that is all we have today. So here is a summary of all the stories that you have heard today.
In wake of the Florida school shooting earlier this month, numerous companies have cut ties with the NRA in an act of protest. The NRA is also facing pressure from Trump, who has proposed stronger gun laws, such as raising the age limit for buying certain types of guns, as well as banning bump stocks. Trump has also proposed that teachers carry concealed guns in the classroom to prevent school shootings, such as the recent attack in Florida, with his solution having been met with controversy from survivors, teachers, and the general public. Trump has also announced the largest ever sanctions against North Korea, and North Korea has condemned these sanctions but has left the door open to talks with the US. And in final Donald Trump news, his former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, recently paid former senior European politicians to lobby for Ukraine's previous pro-Russia government, a new indictment says.
In Myanmar, Muslim Rohingya villages are being burned down. The government denies targeting civilians and blames Muslim militants for the destruction of these villages. Many Rohingya have fled to neighbouring Bangladesh. Ian McNicol has resigned as the General Secretary of the Labour Party and is expected to be replaced by an ally of Jeremy Corbyn. Meanwhile, Labour faces internal division over the UK's continued membership of the single market, despite Corbyn's pledge that a Labour government would keep a post-Brexit UK in the customs union. Google Assistant will receive many new upgrades this year, including 30 languages and routines, which Android hopes will help their competition with Apple and Amazon. New research has shown that over half of the world's oceans are being fished industrially, posing huge threats to marine resources and sustainability of the fishing industry.
Twitter has received accusations of being politically biased against right-wing Twitter accounts after it purged thousands of so-called bot accounts in the wake of the indictment by Special Counsel Mueller. The UN Security Council has delayed a vote that would decide on a ceasefire in Syria. The situation is worsening in eastern Ghouta, where 462 people have been killed just last week. Russia wants a change to the draft resolution, but has been accused by Western powers for stalling for time. France, the UK and the US have stressed the need to act now. Theresa May has launched a review of tuition fees and university funding, calling for better value for students, however, has already ruled out completely removing tuition fees altogether.
Becoming a member of Warwick Congress has never been easier. With exclusive interviews, articles and careers events for our members, don't miss out on the benefits that Warwick Congress membership can provide. Sign up now at www.warwickcongress.com. You've been listening to Warwick Congress Weekly. Our podcast will be back at the same time next Tuesday.